Good morning, everybody. It is a lovely morning here down in Hertfordshire, so hopefully it's the same wherever you are. And welcome to the first of 3 sessions on introducing the new apprenticeship standards in hospitality. So today is an overview of the changes to apprenticeships moving from SACE to standards, and we'll be running over all the content briefly, with further sessions planned next week and the week after, covering on-programme delivery and endpoint assessment. We're going to look at the requirements for the new standards, so give you a brief overview of what's changed and why. Looking at the on-programme delivery and assessment requirements, again looking at endpoint assessment, and it's a brief overview. The differences between SACE and new standards, because there are also some similarities, and also a brief overview of funding. Moving on to the requirements for the new apprenticeship standards. For those of you that have been around a little while, you may know that the government commissioned a gentleman called Doug Richard back in 2011-2012 to carry out a review of apprenticeships, mainly in England, but it kind of covered some of the devolved nations as well. And he produced a report that the government produced a response to back in 2013. As a result of that report, there was a plan to review and revise all apprenticeships in England, and a group of trailblazers, I think it was initially 5 back in October 2013, were pulled together, mainly from the STEM sectors, so engineering and finance and science, to look at creating new apprenticeships that met the needs of employers. So as I say in the first point here, they came to the conclusion that apprenticeships should be designed by employers and should be for employers, and actually they should lead to a specific occupation. So within the hospitality sector, either something, for example, like a commis chef, a chef de partie, a housekeeper, a front of house reception role, or even a hospitality manager. They identified, as with current SACE apprenticeships, that they should take at least 12 months of on-programme delivery and assessment. So again, currently SACE apprenticeships are 12 months minimum, but that obviously is for everything. This is just 12 months for on-programme. What they also identified is a requirement for independent endpoint assessment. Now, the employer feedback as part of the Doug Richard review identified that although the qualifications within the apprenticeships were valued, apprentices were often being completed, and this is going across sectors, obviously not just for hospitality, where the employers didn't deem them to be fully competent against their requirements, but because they'd achieved the qualifications, they had achieved the apprenticeship. So they wanted to bring in this idea of an independent endpoint assessment, that an organisation who hasn't been involved in the delivery of the apprenticeship, as either a provider or an employer, to confirm occupational competence. So it would be somebody different to say, actually, yes, you meet the requirements of the apprenticeship and therefore we think you are occupationally competent. And I'll go into a bit more detail about that as we go through. There is a mandatory 20% off the job training requirement. Again, an apprenticeship should not just be, as in some sectors it's been identified as, cheap labour. There should be a job with training. And again, there is now a mandatory cash contribution. Again, I apologise, there's a slight typographic error in this presentation. It should be either 10% or 100% of the levy contribution. And I'll come on to that again in the funding section. One of the big requirements changes that there are no mandatory qualifications in apprenticeship standards anymore. So if an employer group decide they don't require a qualification, they don't have to include a qualification. The only difference there being there is still a requirement for English and maths, either GCSE or functional skills, depending on the requirements or the prior attainment of the learner. And again, the level of maths and English required will be dictated by the level of the apprenticeship. Now, originally the government planned to withdraw all current SACE frameworks in England by July 2017. This was a goal they had back in early 2014, and it's not happening. The production of new apprenticeship standards to replace SACE frameworks has taken a lot longer than anybody had actually thought, including the employer groups creating these standards. And there isn't a full replacement of apprenticeship standards to SACE frameworks. So the government moved that target by saying by the end of 2020, which at the time was the end of the current parliament. Obviously, recent actions have changed that. Means that the plan is to withdraw all SACE frameworks by 2020. Now, they made the start of withdrawing frameworks back in 2016. These were the ones that had either low or very or no or very low take-up, so either registrations or certifications, and they are starting to work their way through the very large list of apprenticeship standard frameworks that are currently available. And what they're looking at now is where there is a direct replacement for an apprenticeship, where there's a direct standard replacement for a framework, they are looking at whether they can switch off the whole framework or whether there's elements of that framework that need to be switched off. So as I said earlier, we'll go on to this slide in a little bit more detail later on. There are some similarities between SACE and standards. Like I said, off-the-job training and contributions, but there are some big changes. So these are mainly around things like on-programme delivery and assessment. So, as I said earlier, there aren't any mandatory qualifications. What a provider will need to do going forward is design their on-programme delivery and assessment around the requirements that are set out in the apprenticeship standard. So there are two components to an apprenticeship standard. There is the two-page, possibly slightly longer if it's a core and options approach, what I call job description / marketing information about that occupation, that basically outlines, in order to be deemed occupationally competent in that role, this is what you need to know, be able to demonstrate, and be able to act like. So knowledge, skills and behaviours. Very similar to current SACE apprenticeships, with your knowledge component, your competence component, and obviously your employee rights and responsibilities and personal thinking skills. So they're still there, just in a slightly different format. So you would need to design your delivery to cover the knowledge, skills and behaviours that are outlined in the standard. And it will need to take a minimum of 12 months, with at least 20% being delivered off the job. And again, I'll cover this in more detail in the next presentation next week. So if we're looking at a 12-month apprenticeship programme, so most hospitality programmes are between 12 and 18 months average in length. Obviously it can take longer. Obviously the minimum time it can take is 12 months then, plus the endpoint assessment time. You're looking at about 9.5 weeks in a 12-month period. So possibly something like day release. However, you can tailor this according to yours and the employer's needs. So it could be if a candidate is working a split shift, then actually they do 2 half days or three parts of a day during a week in off-the-job training with yourself. But that is a mandatory requirement of 20% off the job. You have a list of minimum requirements, which is what the standard actually is outlining. And an employer can add additional requirements to the training programme as they see fit, and pay additionally outside of the apprenticeship funding agreement for this training. So it could be, for example, that the employer wants the candidate to do a first aid course. So again, that can be built into the programme but funded outside of the apprenticeship. So the reason why there aren't any mandatory qualifications is the fact that the government wanted the focus to be on the apprenticeship itself rather than the component parts. They wanted the apprenticeship certificate to be seen as being the qualification, as being the standard, rather than subcomponents. There are some apprenticeship standards, for any of you that do deliver outside of the hospitality sector, that do have mandatory qualifications in it, and these are accepted by the government where it's either a license to practice, so for example in the adult care sector or the childcare sector, or where there is significant health and safety risks if a mandatory qualification is not included, so for example within the engineering sector. But where the employer group don't have a mandatory qualification to confirm employment or to allow employment as a license to practice, or where there is a significant health and safety risk, then yes, there aren't any mandatory qualifications. There is a set of employer occupational briefs that have also been created by the employer group to support the assessment plan and apprenticeship standard documentation. These aren't published on the government website, they are published on the People First website, and if at the end of the presentation you pop your email address into the networking box, then I can send you out the link to those employer occupational briefs. These just list all of the components of the standard and assessment plan with a bit more detail as to the content required for on-programme delivery. So it gives you a bit more help to understand what you actually need to do in terms of planning your on-programme assessment and delivery section. In terms of delivery methodology, the timings and the cost of how much it's going to cost to deliver this on-programme element, you will negotiate this with your employer at the beginning of the programme alongside your choice of endpoint, or their choice of endpoint assessment organisation, if there is a choice. Not all standards in all sectors do have multiple endpoint assessment organisations at the moment, and you will then draw up a legal contract between yourself and the employer which will outline on-programme delivery, timings, dates, costs, and if they are not a levy-paying organisation, how they are, and they have to contribute the 10% employer contribution in order for you to draw down the remaining 90%, how and when that is going to be paid, either on a monthly, quarterly, annually, or 6-monthly basis. So the freedom of payment is up to you and the employer, but they will need to be listed in the contract. And contracts, draft contracts and sample contracts can actually be found on the AELP website. So yeah, so this is a very big change for apprenticeship providers in terms of on-programme delivery, in the fact that you don't have that framework of qualifications to support you in your delivery anymore. So you have to, in some respects, design it yourself, which does give you some flexibility to actually meet your specific employer's specific needs. And again, with the variety of hospitality standards out there at the moment, so you have a small number available to you. The number will increase. So we have at level 2, we have hospitality team member, which is pulling together what was a variety of different SACE frameworks. So kitchen services, it's front of house, it's housekeeping, it is some of your more kitchen porter type roles as well. So the hospitality team member will include some of the preparation elements of food production. So if you're looking at food prep, and if you're looking at food prep, then again your hospitality team member there would suit you. You have a commis chef, which is a slightly more detailed level 2 cookery. So it's what would be probably currently considered as your professional cookery role. With a lot of content included within that. And again, we'll go into more detail in the on-programme elements and the next presentation. You have at level 3, you have a hospitality supervisor role. So again, very similar to the hospitality team member, covering a variety of sectors. So head barista, food and drink service, so senior food and drink service, so maitre d', something along those lines, alongside head reception and head of housekeeping. And at level 3, in terms of professional cookery standards, we have a chef de partie, and we also have a senior chef production cooking role. At level 4, we have a hospitality manager, which is quite self-explanatory, and we also have a senior chef culinary arts. So we have levels 2, 3, and 4 available at the moment. There is plans to develop a food production and cooking role, so probably not as detailed as the commis chef, but suitable for more of a production type kitchen rather than a restaurant kitchen. So moving on to endpoint assessment. So endpoint assessment, this is the new component of apprenticeship standards, which is very different to existing SACE. So it is designed to confirm occupational competence. It's set by the employer group as part of the design of the apprenticeship. So when the employers are designing the apprenticeship to meet an occupational standard, they identify what activities they think are the most appropriate activities for a candidate to demonstrate at the end of their apprenticeship that they are occupationally competent against that standard. The idea is that it's carried out by an independent organisation that's been approved by the Education and Skills Funding Agency. So it was the Skills Funding Agency up until very recently. They've merged with the EFA to become the ESFA. So they're now looking after funding for all learners up to the, well, from primary school up to post-16 and including post-16. So the thing with endpoint assessment is it does differ according to each apprenticeship standard. There is no standard approach. And this is common with the use of the word standard across all elements. With SACE, we had a framework that every apprenticeship fitted in. So it did have maths, it did have English, it may have had ICT. It did have a knowledge component, it did have a competency component, it did have employee rights and responsibilities, and it did have personal learning and thinking skills. In the new apprenticeship standards, pretty much anything goes. As long as there is an independent endpoint assessment at the end, that is the key and the confirmed element that every apprenticeship group that is designing a standard has to meet. They have to meet the endpoint assessment requirements. Activities that we've seen across all of the endpoint across all the apprenticeship standards out there across sectors are varied in terms of titling, but actually all come under similar types of assessments. So knowledge testing, either by a multiple choice test or a short answer written exam, practical observations in the workplace, business projects, professional discussions and interviews, and again within hospitality we have things like for the commis chef and the chef de partie that we know of at the moment, you have something like that's also called a culinary challenge. So this is a bit like an episode of MasterChef in some respects. So it has to be in a closed kitchen or a training environment, and the candidates have 2 hours to produce a 2-course meal for 2 people. And all of this will be discussed and agreed as part of the planning phase at the beginning of the endpoint assessment activity. So again, an additional element to that candidate outside of an observation. So endpoint assessments, like I said, have this independence element. It was brought in by the government because they're trying to align the delivery of apprenticeships to the delivery of academic style qualifications by saying actually an apprenticeship is no less challenging and is as worthy as an academic qualification. So for example, GCSEs and A levels. It's, it has a specific purpose, and it is not, of a lower standard than anything else. So I'm not saying it's right and I'm not saying it's wrong. They're designing it to bring everything in line. And for those of you that are keeping up to date with education reforms, obviously with the introduction of the Sainsbury Review and these new T levels that are coming in, so for technical professional education reform, there's a further bringing together of the vocational routes of both full-time learners and apprentices to align them to a similar standard to those taken by an academic learner with a specific route pathway. So as I said earlier, it's designed to confirm occupational competence, and it is somebody who is independent to that learner, who's not been involved anywhere in the delivery, that is confirming occupational competence. This should mean that it's a fair and transparent process and that it's aligned to the employer requirements. And this is also an independent endpoint assessment organisation that actually has an external quality assurance organisation that is actually standardising the delivery of endpoint assessment. So there are checks and balances at every level, along with appeals processes that obviously can be used if necessary. Prior to starting endpoint assessment, and again we'll go into this in more detail in the third webinar, there is a gateway process. So a candidate should not be submitted for endpoint assessment until both the employer and the training provider are confident that the apprenticeship or the apprentice is competent to the standards required by that employer and also to the standard that is required in the apprenticeship program itself. Again, some employers have higher standards than those set by the apprenticeship standard, which may need to be met before endpoint assessment can be commenced. Again, the minimum requirement is that's set out in the apprenticeship standard. So if there are any doubts that a candidate will not pass endpoint assessment, they should not be registered for endpoint assessment until both parties, so the training provider and the employer, are happy that that candidate has a strong chance of passing. So, as I said earlier, the endpoint assessment activities within most of the hospitality sector is a knowledge test, mainly multiple choice questions. There is a practical observation in the workplace, and then there are business projects and professional discussions, and also with the commis chef and chef de partie, like I said earlier, there is the culinary challenge to include with that as well. So now we're going to look at the difference between SACE and standards, because as I said at the beginning of the presentation, there are some differences, the biggest one mainly being endpoint assessment, but there are a lot of commonality between the two as well. So it's not all doom and gloom. So the hospitality standards, as I said earlier, the government was planning originally to withdraw all apprenticeship frameworks by 2017. That isn't happening, but they have got the hospitality standards out for consultation to withdraw the level 2, 3 and 4. It says here October 18. I have been told it's now been moved back or forward to April 18. So we're waiting on the final decision as to whether they're going to switch the hospitality frameworks off after April 18. So between now and then, if it is confirmed that they are being withdrawn, then you have SACE available between now and April 18. Then after April 18, you only have the standards to choose from. With SACE, obviously, SACE has limited flexibility. So because it is qualification-led rather than specific requirements-led, again, a provider has the choice of the optional units to choose from, but not necessarily the right combination of units if the rules of combination don't work in their favour. Both have a minimum 12-month period, and they both actually have a 20% off the job training requirement. But within SACE, obviously the 20% off the job training requirement isn't actually fully monitored by the ESFA, but this will be monitored by them going forward. And again, it will be part of the contract between yourself and the employer. As I said earlier, SACE has limited flexibility. Obviously, it is also not as detailed. If you look at the SACE framework booklet, it doesn't give you the level of detail that the current or the new standards do give you for a specific occupation. So there is a lot more detail contained within the standard than there is within the SACE. And for example, the example I've given here is actually a retail example in terms of specialist pathways. The hospitality team member will have specialist pathways within it. So, for example, barista, food and drink service, for example, but they're actually not a defined certificated pathway. So it will just be a hospitality team member. What I would suggest to you if you are looking at delivering apprenticeship standards in hospitality going forward is to look very closely at the requirements and the occupational and the skills, knowledge and behaviours that are required for each occupation. For example, within the commis chef, it is very detailed. There is a very aspirational requirement within that a candidate will know, if not be able to demonstrate most of the skills listed in the standard, which is obviously quite different to someone who is in more of a production kitchen or a large chain style restaurant kitchen where there is limited menu choices. So again, look at those standards to see if those standards are suitable for your learners, and it may be that you look at an alternative standard than the one you're initially considering. As I said earlier, food production and cooking, which I think is going to be a very popular apprenticeship standard, is currently being discussed by the employer group, and I'm assuming an expression of interest will be submitted by the employer group at some point within the next couple of months. The government going into purdah for the general election has meant that there has been a slight delay on certain aspects, but employers are still working on developing new apprenticeship standards. So, what are the main differences? Like I said earlier, and I keep mentioning it, but there aren't any mandatory qualifications within the hospitality standards. The funding for apprenticeships is now based on the occupation and not based on individual qualification components. So as providers, if you are working with an employer, they may ask you to provide them with a detailed cost breakdown of how you are going to deliver this apprenticeship. So it may be that they ask you to break down the cost of delivery hours. So how much is a staff member paid for delivering on program? And it is that level of detail that some employers may ask for. You have the ability to quote up to the funding cap that's set for each occupation. You can go above that funding cap, but the employer has to pay this out of their own pocket. It isn't co-funded, and it isn't fundable by the levy if they're a levy-paying employer. So you have more flexibility to potentially charge more or charge an appropriate rate for the delivery of services that you provide. As I said earlier, the standards outline the minimum requirements, and there is a 10% cash contribution. At the moment with SACE frameworks, obviously for 19 plus learners, there is a 50% funding reduction on qualifications, and there is an expectation that employers pay that 50% contribution. That contribution is often paid in kind, but going forward it is a mandatory 10% cash contribution. The ESFA will be monitoring this contribution from the employers where it's required via your ILR process on a monthly basis. On a quarterly basis. So they will check to see each quarter, has that employer paid you 1 quarter of the required 10% contribution. If that employer decides to pay the full amount up front, then fine. But obviously if they're paying on a monthly basis, you'll need to be able to demonstrate that in your ILR returns. Likewise, when it comes to audit, the ESFA may ask to see copies of receipted invoices to demonstrate that actually the the payments have actually been received from the employer. So, moving nicely on to funding. So funding has changed, and funding has changed for both SACE frameworks and apprenticeship standards as of the 1st of May. So all apprenticeship frameworks and standards now have a set funding cap, and SACE frameworks, you may notice, have a slightly lower funding cap than may have been paid previously. This is a funding cap based on all learners of all ages, so there is now no difference for an apprentice who is over 19, an apprentice who is over 25, or an apprentice working for a large employer. The same amount of funding is paid at each level. And as I said a couple of minutes ago, that there is a mandatory cash contribution, which is either 10% of the funding amount, or it is 100% because the employer is a levy-paying organisation, and the levy-paying organisation, for anybody who isn't aware of it, is a company with a pay bill of over £3 million per annum, irrespective of numbers of employees, and they will be paying 0.5% of that pay bill to the government into a digital levy pot for them to spend on apprenticeship delivery only. The government does top up that pot by a further 10%. So, SACE funding, I've said here, actually ranges from, in hospitality, again there's a slight typographic error here, I apologise, to between £1,500 and £3,000 for all hospitality standards from the 1st of May. And it is still less than an apprenticeship standard. So there are, again, and I can send the links out to people afterwards. There are links to how much each funding band is worth. So, for example, CommiChef attracts £9,000 worth of funding per learner, which is quite attractive. If you're looking at, say, for example, a £1,500 replacement on SACE, but obviously the detail required for that CommiChef is a lot more than is required for the equivalent SACE framework. The cost of delivery and assessment, like I said earlier, is negotiated between you and the employer. So, for example, with CommieChef, it may be that you actually negotiate a price of £7,000 with the employer. The employer will either pay £700 as a 10% contribution, or you will draw down from their digital pot the £7,000 out of their levy. So if they're a levy-paying organisation, obviously they are going to potentially want to pay the maximum amount to get the most out of their levy pot, especially if it's quite a large levy pot. But then you do have that negotiation. But that negotiation and that £9,000 for CommieChef will also include the cost of endpoint assessment. As I say here, endpoint assessment could be up to 20% of the overall funding cap. So when you're looking at your costs, again, you need to factor in the cost of 20% of that funding. So, for example, if it's a £5,000 apprenticeship standard, endpoint assessment could cost anything up to £1,000. So you need to ensure that you've got £1,000 available to pay for the endpoint assessment out of that funding cap. Funding endpoint assessment costs are available on a case-by-case basis where Pearson are the endpoint assessment organisation, and we'll go into more detail in that as part of the endpoint assessment presentation. If it's a small employer, so for example they have less than 50 employees, they won't have to pay the 10% contribution, so their apprenticeships will be fully funded for 16 to 18 apprentices only if they don't fall under the levy cap. If that employer does pay a levy, then they won't get the 10% contribution. The word's gone out of my head, but yeah, they won't have to pay the 10% contribution, but because they will be using their levy pot to pay the 100% in total. And it is possible that there are some companies, not necessarily in the hospitality industry, but there are some companies out there that do have less than 50 employees that do have a large pay bill. So funding, like I said earlier, is still claimed via the ILR. So it's either paid out of your government contract that you have or via your lead provider, or it comes out of the levy pot, so the digital account that each employer will have with their levy allocation in it. If you have an employer that's managed to spend all of their levy, and they still want to take on more apprentices, then they can do so, but this will be on the co-contribution rate, so they will then have to pay 10% of that learner's apprenticeship fee, and then you can claim the remaining 90% out of your contract allocation pot. And obviously with everything that's happening at the moment, should you have a contract allocation pot or contract allocation available to you. So that is the plan, and an employer has every month they pay into the levy pot and they can draw down from that pot. That levy allocation, that levy amount is available to spend for up to 2 years. After 2 years, it's removed from their levy pot and it then goes back to the Treasury. To do what, I will leave you to decide. So that is me for the moment. Now I have had one question that's come through that says, what happens if no EPA picks up a standard? Very, very good question, and it is a concern of the government at the moment. There are some apprenticeship standards out there that are available for delivery that do not have an EPA organisation attached. Without an EPA organisation, an apprentice cannot complete an apprenticeship. There are discussions happening at the moment that actually if there isn't an EPA organisation available, then a company should not start an apprenticeship, should not start that apprenticeship standard delivery until there is an EPA organisation. Within hospitality, there are a number of EPA organisations available to choose from across all of the occupational standards. So it's not necessarily applicable to this sector, but yes, there are some sectors out there that do not have an EPA. So I think the government are going back to those employer groups and asking them what their plans are to get an EPA organisation in order to be able to complete an apprenticeship, because again, a provider who starts an apprenticeship without an EPA organisation cannot complete their learner, and therefore a provider's success rates are then affected, and future contracting ability is also then potentially affected as well, and potentially Ofsted grades. So there is a quite a tied-in approach to not having an EPA organisation. So yes, there is a an idea at the moment, and there was a suggestion from organisations like the AELP and the AOC that actually if there isn't an EPA organisation listed, actually you shouldn't be starting an apprenticeship programme. And you should be contacting the employer group or the chair of that employer group to find out what the plan is to have an EPA organisation. It isn't easy to become an EPA organisation, anybody can, but it's not easy. But yeah, that's that. So I will write all of these out and I will submit the answers to all of you in a moment. So I've had a further question saying what percentage is Pearson's charging for the EPA for the hospitality standards? So as I said a moment ago, we don't actually have a set price for hospitality EPA at the moment. It is based on volumes of learners and locations of learners. So again, if you speak to your account manager and talk to them, then again we can then start the discussions as to what the percentage will be for EPA within Pearson. As I said earlier, it won't be any more than the 20% because that's what we're bound by. So it'll be anything up to 20%. So if you're working out on your costs, then again you work out the 20%, and then anything that's not spent as part of EPA obviously helps shore up your delivery costs as well. But you do need to bear in mind that there will be potentially resit charges as well. If a candidate doesn't complete an EPA, doesn't pass EPA first time, then the candidate can and probably will have an opportunity to resit, but there will be charges for that as well. So again, they need to be discussed on an individual basis.